Have you ever walked away from someone, quietly, with no drama, no final fight, just silence, and suddenly they explode with anger? They lash out. They smear you. They act like you're the problem. And for a moment you might question yourself. Did I do something wrong? Did I hurt them? But what if the truth is the opposite of what you've been conditioned to believe? What if their rage isn't about what you did, but what they refuse to face? This is the hidden battlefield of emotional manipulation, and most people have no idea it exists. Here's the uncomfortable truth: people who operate from deception, who feed on control and illusions, crumble when their mask is exposed. And nothing exposes them more than someone they couldn't break rising in silence. Let's challenge a common lie we're told, that when someone's angry, they must have a good reason, that their emotion is proof of your mistake. But that's not always true. Some people rage not because they're hurt, but because they're ashamed. Ashamed that their manipulation didn't work. Ashamed that you didn't collapse when they pulled away. Ashamed that the game they were playing ended with you choosing peace instead of participation. And that shame is so unbearable, they wrap it in anger. They throw it at you, hoping you'll catch it, because they can't hold it themselves. This video is not about bashing anyone. It's about seeing clearly. Because when you see clearly, you don't need to argue. You don't need to defend your peace. You simply know. This is where Stoicism meets personal transformation. This is where we move from pain to clarity, not by lashing out, but by owning the stillness. And once you grasp this, once you truly understand why they're mad, why they're spiraling, why they can't let go, you won't feel confused anymore. You'll feel free. So if you've ever been made to feel guilty for setting boundaries, or felt punished just for healing, this message is for you. And what's coming next will not only validate your journey, it will give you language for everything you've silently endured. Stay with me, because the ending might just change how you see every goodbye in your life. 1. The game they played and lost. They thought they were winning, didn't they? Every little manipulation, every calculated silence, every backhanded compliment, each moment of gaslighting that left you second-guessing your own reality. It all felt like power to them. They played their game with a smug sense of control, as if you were a puppet and they were the master pulling invisible strings. But what they didn't account for, what they never truly understood, was that games like these only work when the other player doesn't know it's a game. Once you awaken, once you begin to recognize the patterns, the script falls apart. And when you chose not to react, not to beg, not to plead, not to chase or retaliate, their entire structure collapsed. Because the truth is, they never had real power. They only had what you unknowingly gave them: your confusion, your need to fix things, your loyalty, your heart. That's what they preyed on. And that's what they lost the moment you stepped back into clarity. Ask yourself this. Was it ever about love, respect, connection? Or was it about control disguised as closeness? Was it about companionship, or was it about dominance through manipulation masked as care? The signs were there. They tested boundaries not to understand you better but to see how far they could push. They withheld affection just long enough to make you anxious, then gave you breadcrumbs to keep you hoping. They twisted your words to make you question your own memory, and when you finally tried to stand up for yourself, they labeled you too emotional, too sensitive, crazy, or unstable. This wasn't random. It was a design, one rooted in their own fear of vulnerability, in their own inability to hold space for someone genuine without needing to feel superior. But the most dangerous part, they convinced themselves they were always one step ahead. They saw your empathy as a weakness, your kindness as an invitation to take more, and your silence as submission. What they didn't expect was for you to grow in that silence. To use it not as a prison, but as a chrysalis. While they thought they were breaking you down, you were actually waking up. Slowly. Patiently. With clarity that didn't come from rage, but from realization. And when that realization hit, when you understood the game, not just in your mind but in your spirit, you didn't explode. You didn't scream. You didn't try to make them see the truth. You just stopped participating. You stopped giving them your energy, your attention, your emotional reaction, and in doing so, you pulled the one thread that unraveled their illusion of control. It shattered them. Because now, they weren't dealing with the version of you they had constructed in their mind, the predictable, apologetic, ever-forgiving version. No. Now they were confronted with someone they never expected, a grounded, clear, untouchable version. And that terrified them. Because they had built their sense of power on your compliance, not realizing that once you broke the cycle, once you stood in your power and walked away, there was nothing left for them to feed on. Their control didn't just weaken, it ceased to exist. It's a fundamental truth in Stoicism and in all Stoic relationships. You cannot control others, only your own response. And your response, when it became calm, firm, and free from emotional chaos, revealed everything they were trying to hide, not from you, but from themselves. They weren't mad at you. They were ashamed that the tactics they used to control others no longer worked on someone who had evolved beyond them. That's why they act out. That's why they lash out, why they talk behind your back, why they suddenly need to discredit you. Because the more you shine in your clarity, the more obvious their dysfunction becomes. They wanted to be the puppeteer, but now the puppet's gone. The stage is empty. And they're left holding strings that lead nowhere. That kind of collapse, internal, invisible, soul deep, is the collapse of self-deception. And here's what Stoicism teaches us. Those who live by manipulation die by it too, not physically, but morally, emotionally, spiritually. Their internal rot grows with every false story they tell to keep themselves from confronting the truth, that they ruined something real. And even now, even as they try to paint themselves as the victim, they know deep down they're playing catch-up with their own guilt. You didn't ruin the game, they did. You just chose not to play. Think of the courage that takes. In Stoic relationships, the greatest strength is not in overpowering someone, but in choosing peace over performance. And that's what you did. Your absence became a lesson they never intended to learn, and now they're grappling with it daily. So when they rage, when they spiral, when they try to bait you back into old patterns, remember. It's not about you. It's about their crumbling identity. They're not mad at you, they're ashamed of themselves. And that shame? It's the cost of the game they lost. Let that truth anchor you. Let it remind you that your growth, your silence, your decision to evolve, it wasn't just self-protection. It was a declaration of your worth. And no one who truly honors your soul would ever need to control it. You didn't win by defeating them. You won by stepping out of the arena completely. That's real power. That's the Stoic path. And that's just the beginning. 2. The silence that shattered them. You see, when you stopped talking, they didn't hear silence, they heard judgment. Not from you, but from themselves. And that's what tore through their ego like a storm. Silence isn't empty. It's full. Full of the things they tried to avoid: accountability, exposure, reality. Because when you finally went quiet, it wasn't because you had nothing to say. It was because you had said everything that could be said, and still nothing changed. So you withdrew, not in weakness but in wisdom. And that silence? It echoed in all the spaces they once filled with dominance. Your absence began to haunt them louder than your presence ever could. This is where the entire illusion they built starts to collapse. Because manipulators rely on noise. They feed on your reactions, your defenses, your attempts to explain. As long as you're talking, they're twisting. As long as you're pleading, they're performing. But the moment you grow still, the moment you simply stop playing, they're left with their own chaos, unfiltered and unmasked. And it's deafening. Think about how many times you tried to reason, tried to meet them halfway, tried to explain how you felt. And every time, they turned your vulnerability into ammunition. They heard your honesty but used it to tighten the grip. They interpreted your patience as a sign of surrender. They weren't listening to understand, they were listening to find a new angle. But when the sound of your voice disappeared, so did their illusion of control. That's why silence is so powerful in Stoic relationships. It's not the absence of words, it's the presence of boundaries. And boundaries, especially emotional ones, are what manipulators fear most. Because boundaries don't give them room to twist reality. They make everything clear. They make the lines visible. They expose who respects you and who only respects the access you gave them. And when your silence replaced your explanations, they panicked. Because silence removes their ability to gaslight. It removes the emotional leverage. It forces them to sit with the consequences of what they did, without distraction, without diversion, without defense. This is what Stoicism prepares you for. The ability to walk away from drama without the need to announce it. To detach not out of spite, but out of self-respect. And it's this detachment that shook them to their core. Because for the first time, they had no script. No cues. No emotional outbursts to feed on. Just the brutal, unrelenting stillness of a person who had finally seen enough. And in that stillness, a mirror formed. A mirror that didn't lie. A mirror that showed them not the version of themselves they told the world about, but the truth, the manipulative, deceptive, insecure version they've been avoiding. That's why they're angry now. Not because you left a mess, but because you didn't leave any at all. There's nothing they can clean up, nothing they can fix, nothing they can use to pretend they're the victim. Your silence is too clean, too final, too revealing. It strips them of their favorite weapon, confusion. Now they're the ones confused. Now they're the ones spinning. And the worst part for them? They don't know how to get back in. Because everything they used to do, every tactic, every guilt trip, every love bomb, falls flat when you stop responding. When you've truly healed, when you've truly seen the pattern, you don't unsee it. You can't. Your silence becomes sacred. It becomes your peace. And it becomes their torment. Because silence forces a reckoning. It forces them to confront their own hollowness. And deep down, they know they burned the bridge. Not in a blaze of glory, but through a slow drip of lies, manipulation, and ego. And now, with you gone, with your silence echoing through their delusion, they're left facing the truth. You were the real one. You were the anchor. You were the one who stayed when you should have left. You were the one who gave when there was nothing given in return. And now that you've gone silent, they don't just miss the noise, they miss the meaning. They miss the access. They miss the security of being able to pull you back whenever they wanted. That's what they truly lost. And that's why they're spiraling. They never thought you'd actually leave. They thought your love, your loyalty, your patience meant they had forever. But what they misunderstood, what they never even tried to comprehend, is that silence doesn't come suddenly. It builds. It builds through disappointment, through betrayal, through every moment you cried alone because they didn't care enough to understand. It builds through the cracks they kept ignoring, through the boundaries they kept crossing, through the trust they kept breaking. And when it finally comes, it comes with a weight they can't carry. Because it says everything you never needed to scream. It tells the story of your resilience, your growth, your strength. And it reveals their weakness, not through accusation, but through absence. And that's the truth they can't accept. That you didn't need to ruin them. You just needed to remove yourself. And in doing so, you revealed how fragile their control actually was. That's the message your silence sends. It's not just that you're done. It's that you're different now. You've outgrown their games. You've outgrown the need to prove your worth to someone who never saw it. You've outgrown the habit of explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. And that growth, that stoic transformation, is what makes them furious. Not because you were wrong, but because you were right. Because everything they denied is now undeniable. Everything they dismissed is now glaring. And everything they thought they had control over is now gone. That's the power of stillness. That's the weight of silence. So if you're watching this and you've ever felt guilt over going silent, let that go. You didn't go silent to punish them. You went silent to protect yourself. And in Stoicism, that's not cowardice, it's courage. It's clarity. It's the recognition that your energy is too valuable to waste on someone who only heard you when you cried. You owe no one your peace. You owe yourself the freedom to walk away from anything that dims your light. And if that silence unsettles them, that's not your burden. That's their shame catching up. Let it. And if this part of the message resonates with you, if you've felt the deep power of silence in your own life, take a second right now to like this video and comment number 1 below so we know this truth is speaking to you. And if you haven't yet, subscribe to the channel, because these conversations, rooted in stoicism and real healing, they're just getting started. You're not alone. And your peace deserves a voice, even if it's silent. 3. The shame beneath the rage. They'll never say it outright, but you can see it in the way they react, the way they deflect, the way they twist the story. Shame is the root. Not sadness. Not heartbreak. Shame. And shame is far more corrosive than anger could ever be. Anger is loud, performative, easy to broadcast. Shame, on the other hand, is silent, heavy, buried so deep that even they don't know where it ends and their defensiveness begins. But it's there. Every time they lash out, every time they project, every time they say you're the one who changed or accuse you of being cold, that's not truth speaking, it's shame trying to protect itself. It's their ego scrambling for cover. Because facing what they've done, admitting they were cruel to someone who only wanted connection, who only offered grace, would dismantle their self-image. They'd have to look in the mirror without the armor of justification, and that's unbearable for someone who's built their identity on being untouchable. What most people don't understand is that those who manipulate often do so not out of pure malice, but out of deep insecurity, fear of being seen, fear of being irrelevant, fear of being powerless. And when you stop playing the role they assign to you, the role of the fragile one, the dependent one, the one who would never leave, they were forced to confront what your silence revealed, that they were the broken one all along. That's the paradox of these toxic dynamics. The person who seems strongest in the moment, the one who controls the narrative, who dictates how the relationship flows, is usually the one most terrified of being seen clearly. Your growth, your healing, your refusal to engage in their chaos became unbearable for them, not because it hurt their heart, but because it confronted their shadow. It exposed the very parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime running from. And rather than look inward, rather than do the work of reflection, of accountability, of growth, they defaulted to rage. Because rage feels strong. Rage feels powerful. But it's a lie. It's a mask. A cover. Underneath, it's shame rotting from within. Ask yourself, why do they keep talking about you even after you've gone silent? Why do they still try to turn people against you, or check up on your life, or act indifferent while clearly reacting? Because they haven't healed. Because your existence, peaceful, strong, and unbothered, forces them to acknowledge their own emotional bankruptcy. That's what Stoicism teaches us. You cannot be moved by someone who hasn't mastered themselves. And their inability to stay grounded in the face of your silence is proof they've mastered nothing. They haven't processed what they did. They haven't owned the damage they caused. Instead, they carry the burden of their actions like a secret cancer. They hide it behind bravado, behind new relationships, behind distractions. But deep down they know. And knowing eats at them. It's the whisper that follows them into every new dynamic, every quiet moment, every mirror. They know they ruined something real. Not by accident, but by choice. And that choice now defines them. That's why they're angry. That's why they're bitter. Because deep down, beneath all the noise, they're ashamed, not just for what they did, but for who they've become in the process. And shame, when left unchecked, metastasizes. It turns people cruel. It makes them envious. It pushes them to tear others down just to avoid the collapse of their own delusions. You didn't cause that shame. You revealed it. By walking away, by choosing integrity over retaliation, by choosing peace over performance, you held up a mirror they never wanted to see. And in Stoic relationships, that mirror is everything. It doesn't scream. It doesn't accuse. It simply reflects. And reflection is deadly to someone who's never looked inward. You didn't become their enemy because you harmed them. You became their enemy because you stopped letting them harm you. And that boundary, that clarity, that strength, It shames them more than any confrontation ever could. Because it makes one thing undeniable: they had something rare, and they threw it away. And now, no matter how much they try to twist the truth, the silence remains. The story, however they try to tell it, can't erase the facts. That you were there. That you cared. That you stayed when it hurt. And that you left when it became clear they wouldn't change. That's a timeline they can't erase. And it's that permanence that fuels their shame. That's why they might act indifferent one day, then hostile the next. Why they might pretend they're over it, then slip in a jab or a passive-aggressive post. Because they're not at peace. They're still wrestling with themselves. Still trying to outrun the consequences of their own actions. And you? You've become a symbol of everything they lost, not because you rubbed it in, but because your existence contradicts their narrative. In Stoicism, we learn not to take these reactions personally. Because they're not about us. They're about the person's inability to confront their truth. And that's what this is. Their anger is a shield. Their deflection is a smokescreen. Their accusations are just attempts to rewrite a story that ended with them exposed. And here's the hardest part for them to accept: that you didn't even try to ruin them. You just stopped letting them ruin you. And that distinction makes all the difference. Because they were prepared for a fight, not for your silence. They were ready to play the game, not to be left behind. And in that moment when you chose stillness, when you walked away without venom or vengeance, you took back all your power. Power they thought they had. Power they never deserved. And that's where the shame comes from. The awareness that they were never in control. That they never really had the upper hand. That all the manipulation, all the deception, all the performance, it was rooted in fear. And fear is never sustainable. It always collapses. So when you see them raging now, or pretending they're fine, or acting like you never mattered, understand what's really happening. That's not strength. That's not closure. That's shame, raw, unresolved, and desperate for a scapegoat. But you're not that scapegoat anymore. You've moved beyond it. You've stepped into a version of yourself that no longer needs to absorb other people's damage to feel valuable. And that evolution? That's what they can't stand. Because it leaves them behind. Not because you abandoned them, but because they refused to rise with you. And now they're stuck. Stuck in the same patterns, the same habits, the same illusions. While you've chosen growth. You've chosen peace. You've chosen the path of inner clarity, of emotional discipline, of freedom. That's Stoicism in action. Not loud, not vengeful, just unshakably calm. And that calmness, it doesn't just reflect your strength. It highlights their weakness. And no amount of rage can drown that out. 4. The strength of walking away. There's a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself with noise. It doesn't seek attention. It doesn't scream or slam doors. It simply exits, quietly, firmly, and completely. That's the strength most people underestimate. And that's the strength you discovered when you finally walked away. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in clarity. When you no longer needed to be heard to know your truth. When you no longer required validation to know your worth. That's when everything shifted. Because up until then, they thought they had you. They mistook your staying for dependence. They saw your patience and thought it was passivity. They saw your loyalty and assumed it meant you were blind. But in reality, you saw everything. You just hoped, maybe even prayed, that if you gave enough love, they'd rise. That if you were soft enough, real enough, steady enough, they'd choose to meet you in that same emotional space. That's not weakness. That's faith. That's the beauty and risk of Stoic relationships, choosing to love without needing to control. But when it became clear they weren't choosing growth, when it was obvious they preferred games to honesty, power over partnership, control over connection, that's when the real decision began. And you made it. You chose yourself. That's not selfish. That's self-respect. The kind of respect that says, I refuse to stay small to protect someone else's ego. It's the same kind of inner strength that Stoicism teaches us to cultivate, not the strength to fight battles you didn't start, but the strength to leave the battlefield entirely. And when you did that, something shifted in the air. They felt it, even if they'd never admit it. Because the person they thought they could manipulate, the one they assumed would always return, the one they believed was too soft to stand alone, disappeared. Not physically, but energetically. The game was over. And they didn't know what to do. Because for people like that, the power is in the reaction. The power is in the comeback, the breakdown, the argument. But when you gave them none of it, they were forced to face the reality that your love was not a weakness, it was a choice. And when that choice was gone, so was their illusion of control. Think about that. The entire dynamic they built relied on your willingness to keep showing up, to keep explaining, to keep forgiving without any evidence of change. And when you finally stopped, when you chose silence over struggle, peace over pleading, distance over dysfunction, that was their true loss. Not because you punished them, but because you stopped tolerating being punished. There's nothing more unnerving to someone who lives off emotional control than realizing their target has detached. That's the moment everything unravels. That's the moment your stillness becomes thunder. And they feel it in every failed attempt to re-engage you. They might try to bait you. Through guilt, through pity, through false kindness. They might test your boundaries with subtle messages, indirect gestures, or even staged encounters. But you've already crossed that threshold. You've already stepped into a life where you no longer betray yourself to keep someone else comfortable. And that shift? That's your liberation. That's where the real transformation lives. In the refusal to keep proving your worth to people committed to misunderstanding it. In the power of walking away from a cycle that only ever offered pain in exchange for your light. That's not something most people do. And that's why it shakes them. Because it forces them to realize they didn't just lose someone, they lost someone who would have stayed, if they had simply chosen honesty. And they didn't. Not because they couldn't, but because they wouldn't. And now, they're living with that choice. Stoicism reminds us, we don't grow by controlling others. We grow by mastering ourselves. And that's what walking away was. It was self-mastery. It was the calm, grounded decision to stop bleeding for someone who kept cutting. To stop explaining to someone who only listened to manipulate. To stop hoping someone would change when their actions already answered the question. And you walked, not to make a statement, but to make a life. A life where peace isn't conditional. Where your worth isn't up for debate. Where you don't have to beg to be respected. That's the kind of strength that can't be faked. That's the kind of strength that speaks louder than rage. And that's why they're still watching. Still reacting. Still affected. Because they didn't think you had it in you. They thought you'd break before you'd rise. They thought your silence was submission. But it wasn't. It was your ascension. Your evolution. Your refusal to be anyone's emotional crutch ever again. So if you're here right now, watching this, wondering if it was right to leave, wondering if you were too harsh, too quick, too silent, let me remind you, no one who values your presence will ever put you in a position where your only choice is absence. You didn't leave too soon. You stayed too long. And now that you're free, now that you're healing, now that you're grounded, they're not mad because you left. They're ashamed because you stayed, gave everything, and still had to leave. And that's a weight they'll carry long after their anger fades. Because you were the one who walked away, not out of pride, but out of love. Love for yourself. And if that kind of power resonates with you right now, if you found strength in silence and growth in stillness, go ahead and like this video. Drop a number 1 in the comments if this message speaks to where you are. And hit subscribe, because we're building something powerful here. Conversations rooted in clarity, self-respect, and stoicism. You deserve a space that honors your journey. And this is it. 5. The growth they didn't anticipate. When someone builds their sense of superiority on your confusion, your growth is not just unexpected, it's threatening. It dismantles the foundation of the false power they believed they had. You were never supposed to evolve in their eyes. You were meant to remain small, apologetic, unsure. That's how they kept their narrative intact. That's how they justified the imbalance, the control, the the subtle disrespect disguised as care. But something inside you shifted. Maybe slowly, quietly, at first, a new thought, a moment of clarity, a boundary you dared to set. And from that moment, the entire story they told themselves about who you are began to unravel. This wasn't rebellion. It wasn't revenge. It was awakening. An awakening rooted in truth. And truth, especially in Stoic relationships, isn't loud, it's evident. It exists whether anyone believes it or not. And the truth of your strength began to outshine the story of your weakness they tried to write. They didn't anticipate that you'd grow into someone who no longer needed their validation, who no longer fed their ego with emotional availability. They didn't anticipate that you'd start questioning the script, the cycle, the patterns that once felt like reality. And the moment you did, the entire structure started to collapse. Because growth doesn't just heal you. It redefines the dynamic. It reveals who was keeping the dysfunction alive. And it makes denial impossible. Your clarity exposed their confusion. Your calmness highlighted their chaos. Your stillness mirrored their instability. They had always depended on you being one step behind, emotionally tangled, trying to fix what they kept breaking. But now you were ahead, not because you were trying to win, but because you stopped playing. That's the part that hurts them. Not your success. Not your peace. But the realization that they no longer affect you the way they used to. That your nervous system no longer reacts to their games. That you no longer feel the need to prove yourself to someone who only ever saw you through the lens of their own insecurity. This is where Stoicism becomes not just philosophy, but lived experience. When you begin to respond from a place of calm conviction, rather than emotional desperation. When you understand that real power isn't in changing someone else, it's in mastering your own response. And you mastered it. Your silence is no longer void. It's a signal. A boundary. A declaration that your peace is no longer up for negotiation. And that terrifies them. Because it makes them irrelevant to your story. For people who thrive on control, irrelevance is unbearable. They don't miss you. They miss the version of you who tolerated their dysfunction. The version who dimmed their light to keep peace. But that version is gone. Not because you killed it with anger, but because you outgrew it with clarity. And that growth didn't come easy. It came through sleepless nights, silent tears, and deep inner work. It came through questioning everything you once believed about yourself. It came from facing your own shadows, forgiving yourself for staying too long, and choosing to live differently. That's what they didn't see. They saw the result but never imagined the process. And now they're angry. Not because you wronged them, but because your growth reflects what they chose to avoid. It exposes their stagnation, their unwillingness to evolve, their decision to stay safe in manipulation rather than risk the vulnerability of real change. You didn't need to say a word. Your transformation speaks volumes. It tells a story of someone who was once underestimated, undervalued, perhaps even broken, but who chose to heal, not out of spite, but out of purpose. And that story is hard for them to watch. Because it reminds them of who they could have been, if they had chosen differently. If they had matched your honesty, your depth, your courage. Instead, they remained stuck. And you soared. This is the secret cost of emotional manipulation. It keeps the manipulator in the past, while the one they tried to break steps into the future. They didn't see your glow coming. They didn't expect your energy to shift so powerfully. They thought they knew you. But they only knew the version of you that was trying to be loved by someone who didn't know how to receive love without control. And now, you've become someone they no longer understand. Because you're not operating from fear anymore. You're not reactive. You're not desperate to be seen. You've seen yourself. And once that happens, no one can use your insecurities against you. They thought they held the pen in your story. But now, they're not even in the pages. That's the kind of transformation that can't be undone. That's the kind of growth that sends silent shockwaves into every space where they still cling to their version of events. And no matter how hard they try to revise the past, the truth stands: you outgrew their game. Not because you wanted to win, but because you finally saw that your peace was never meant to be a prize in someone else's performance. This is what Stoicism looks like in motion, not a cold detachment, but a wise discernment. A steady hand refusing to be shaken. And in that steadiness, you've become a reflection of everything they avoided. They don't hate you. They hate the version of themselves that couldn't keep up. The version that clung to control because they were afraid of being vulnerable. The version that chose manipulation over mutuality. And now, every time they see you thriving, healing, holding your peace like a crown, it cuts. Not because you're cruel, but because your growth holds up a mirror they can't escape. That's why they flinch. That's why they react. Because shame lives in that contrast. You were never the weak one. You were the brave one. The one who chose to rise even when you had every reason to stay low. And that's what they'll never understand. Because that kind of growth, the kind that's born in silence, rooted in pain, and blossoming in clarity, is not something you can fake. It's earned. And you earned it. Every step. Every boundary. Every no. Every quiet exit. You didn't become stronger by winning against them. You became stronger by winning yourself back. And that kind of strength doesn't just change your story. It ends theirs. 6. The lasting weight of consequences. There's a consequence to every action, even the ones people think they got away with. Especially those. Because while the world may not see it immediately, while there might be no dramatic fallout, no big exposure or confrontation, something shifts deep inside the person who betrayed you. It's subtle at first. A moment of discomfort when they hear your name. A pang of guilt when they see someone who carries your energy. A pause when they laugh too loudly, trying to drown out the silence that now follows them. But over time it builds. Because the truth, once known, is a weight that never disappears. And they're carrying it now. Quietly. Desperately. Pretending it doesn't exist. But it does. And they feel it every time they realize they can't go back. That they can't undo the damage they caused. That they can't rewrite the history you both lived. You were real. You were loyal. You showed up when no one else did. And they threw that away. Not because you weren't enough, but because they didn't believe someone like you could ever leave. They thought they had time. They thought your kindness was eternal. They thought your silence was compliance. But now they know. Now they understand that Stoic relationships don't mean endless tolerance. They mean inner mastery. And when you mastered your pain, your boundaries, your vision of what peace really is, they lost all control. And with that loss came the one thing they were most afraid of: consequence. Not the kind that screams. Not the kind that shows up in lawsuits or revenge. But the kind that whispers. The kind that lives in the mirror. The kind that echoes when the noise dies down. They thought they were building something safe for themselves by keeping you small. But instead, they built a prison. One made of denial, regret, and the growing realization that they harmed someone who actually wanted to stay. That's the worst kind of loss. Not the kind you didn't want, but the kind you created. That's what Stoicism teaches us. Your peace is your justice. Not because it harms them, but because it frees you. And that freedom, your glow, your calm energy, your steady detachment, it haunts them. Because they know they did it. They burned the bridge. They torched the connection. And now, every time they remember you, it isn't your suffering they see, it's your growth. It's your grace. It's the light they tried to extinguish shining brighter than ever. That's the weight they carry. A burden they can't share with anyone else, because to admit it would be to confront themselves. And they're not ready. That's why they rage. That's why they talk. That's why they pretend. But the pretending only deepens the void. Because lies, no matter how often repeated, can't cover the truth of a soul that knows what it lost. They could surround themselves with 1,000 distractions, 1,000,000 validations, but none of it replaces authenticity. None of it replaces the peace of someone who loved without condition. And that's what you were. That's what they'll never get back. Because once you walk away, not in anger, But in silence, in dignity, in the full strength of stoicism, you don't return. You don't backtrack. You don't shrink to fit their comfort zone again. And that finality? It shakes them. It reminds them that some losses are permanent. Some doors, once closed, stay closed not out of cruelty, but out of evolution. That's the cost of breaking someone who just wanted to love you. That's the consequence of games that go too far. So let them carry it. Let them feel it. Let them live with it. Because your job now is not to fix them, or help them, or explain to them what they should have already understood. Your job is to keep walking, to keep healing, to keep choosing the kind of strength that doesn't retaliate but radiates. Because that's what true power is. Not control over others, but mastery over your own response. And you've mastered it. If you hadn't, they wouldn't still be thinking about you. You wouldn't still be echoing in their silence. That's not ego. That's reality. Because when someone loses a person of depth, of loyalty, of compassion, they don't replace that. They just try to forget it. And forgetting becomes impossible when that person, the one they took for granted, rises in peace. That's the consequence they live with. And that's the freedom you now hold. If that speaks to you, if you feel the truth of that rising in your chest, then this is your moment to honor that journey. Like this video, and drop a number 1 in the comments if you know the weight of that silence. And don't forget to subscribe, because this channel is for people who are choosing peace, truth, and stoicism over performance, chaos, and pain. You belong here. Your growth deserves a space to breathe. The real victory was never in proving them wrong. It was in proving yourself right, quietly, inwardly, without needing to perform that realization for anyone else. Because in the end, they're not mad at you. They're ashamed of themselves. Ashamed not just of what they did, but of what they allowed themselves to become. And that's something they have to live with, long after the dust has settled, long after the world stops watching. What you carry now isn't anger, isn't bitterness, isn't a need for revenge. What you carry is peace. And peace, when it's earned through pain, through silence, through clarity, becomes unshakable. That peace is your reward, not for surviving them, but for returning to yourself. That's the quiet triumph they'll never understand. Because they're still fighting ghosts. They're still arguing with the version of you they created in their mind. But you're gone. You've stepped into something new, something rooted in awareness, in self-respect, in stoicism. And that shift? It's irreversible. It's not the result of some overnight awakening. It's the product of 1,000 moments you stood in front of yourself and chose healing over habit, truth over illusion, and stillness over noise. That's what makes it powerful. That's what makes it permanent. So if there's any part of you still wondering whether you should have fought harder, whether you should have stayed longer, whether you should have said more, let that go. You said enough? You gave enough. You waited long enough. And your silence now is not emptiness, it's completion. It's the final act of someone who decided their peace was more valuable than their proximity to chaos. And it's okay if they never understand that. It's okay if they tell a story where you're the villain, where you're the problem. Stoicism teaches us, what others believe about us is none of our business. Our business is our mind. Our business is our response. Our business is the life we build once we step outside the storm. And that life? That's what you're walking in now. No longer reacting. No longer explaining. No longer bleeding for people who wouldn't even offer a bandage. You've graduated. And there's no going back. There's only forward, into more grounded relationships, more aligned conversations, more authentic living. Because you now know what peace costs. And you also know it's worth everything. Let them spin. Let them twist. Let them rage. You don't owe them anything. Not your words. Not your presence. Not your validation. You owe yourself peace. You owe yourself rest. You owe yourself a future untainted by people who didn't know what to do with your heart. And that future? It's here now. You've chosen a different way. one rooted in integrity, in calmness, in the kind of emotional maturity that doesn't seek to dominate, but to liberate. That's what Stoicism has gifted you. That's what your silence has protected. And that's what your growth continues to affirm. You're not broken. You're not cold. You're not heartless. You're healed. And healing doesn't scream. It simply lives. Boldly. Quietly. Unapologetically. They're not mad at you. They're ashamed they couldn't rise with you. Let that be what it is. And walk on.